of discourse in the United States. So, John, over to you.
Thanks, Brian. That a few months ago, I woke up and told my wife, I said, the problem with our country, it's truth. And I called a few people, and one of them is a friend in Cincinnati, and she recommended that I talk to Tim Love. And now that I've gotten to know Tim a little bit, I understand why. Let me tell you about Tim. He is the former Vice-Chairman of the Omnicom Group and CEO of their Asia Pacific, India, Middle East, Africa region, which looks like the world without North America. Omnicom, for those of you who don't know, is a leading global advertising and marketing services company. Tim spent 42 years working for a number of major advertising agencies, plus he has authored a fun and insightful book on aging. It's called The Book That Gets Better with Age. Brief commercial. Tim is a graduate of Miami University in Ohio and has a master's in communication from the University of Illinois. A few years ago, he created a podcast series called Discovering Truth, which now actually has 36 half-hour podcasts. And I'm delighted to introduce Tim to you all, and I'm sure you'll find his presentation most interesting. Tim, over to you. You need to.
Thank you.
There you go.
Can you hear me, John?
Yes, we can.
Okay. What I'm going to talk about is discovering truth and how I started in on this journey. And I'm not here this morning to tell you that I know truth, but I've learned a lot from the people that I've talked to, and I've focused on people who are involved in the art and science of communications, because I felt that I needed to look at it not from a political standpoint, but from the standpoint of my profession and expertise, which is marketing communications. So it's really an examination that is looking at communications and its effects on people. Our generation has probably heard of Marshall McLuhan. He was a hero to me when I was studying media and advertising in my early days. And so I've always had a belief that media does affect people. My dad was a used television repairman after World War II. We had a post-World War II bungalow house with one bathroom and 5 people in the family. And there were TVs and radios in every room of the house because he was working at home. So I found out that I was a child of the media before that was even a known term. And my father, I didn't realize it as I was growing up, but my father always enabled us to have the latest technology in communications. He had a ham radio outfit in the basement in which he had started. He put the most fancy antenna on the top of our house that you guys could imagine, and went up there and turned it around so that we could watch the 1964 Cleveland Browns beat the Baltimore Colts in the NFL championship game. I remember one day he came home with a little box, looked almost like this cell phone, like your cell phone. And he handed it to me and he said, "This is going to change your life." And what it was a channel changer. It was the first channel changer, and it had an up button and a down button, and that's it. But it changed my life because I could sit in the chair, and as the youngest member of the family, I was the one that was always, "Hey, Timmy, get up and change the channel." Well, I could change it sitting down. I could change it in a hurry. And so I saw how communications technology at a very early age would change my life. And we've seen this continue on. We had the first color television set in the neighborhood, and that was pretty interesting too. when that happened. So I've had this interest, and I retired in 2013. And during my career, I'd done some lecturing and at different universities on marketing communication. I taught an MBA course the summer after I retired at Oxford University, and cut to the chase, in 2018, I was invited to by Ave Maria University in Naples, Florida. And I don't know if you know about this university. I didn't, but it's a very conservative Catholic university that was started by Monahan of Domino's. And he bought land in the middle of nowhere and built a town, a golf course, a wonderful chapel, and a really good university. It is very conservative. Initially, it was not, and I'm not Catholic, it was not associated with any diocese at first because he wanted to control the setup of the town and everything else. It since has become part of the diocese in that area. But a friend of mine knew the president and told the president that he ought to get me to come talk sometime to their students, because I'd done it so often, and I enjoy doing that. I always learn more from doing it than I get from putting what I put into it. You learn so much from students and teachers. Well, that certainly happened with Ave Maria, because I went out to meet with the director of the faculty, who was a history professor from Princeton. So she was pretty smart. And she told me that they were going to be starting actually it was October 17. She told me they were going to be setting up a new curriculum in their School of Business for communications and marketing. And she thought maybe I could come in the fall at the beginning of the curriculum to talk about and share ideas about marketing, communications, global branding, and so forth. And I said, yeah. So I started studying and thinking about what I might talk about to them that could be of value to this university. And I recalled my studies of how communications technologies changes people's sense of who has the authority for truth. And a big event in all this, as many of you know, was the Reformation in the 15th, 16th century. It was a very divisive time, not unlike now. It had some manifestations that were pretty scary. But what happened was, until the invention of the Gutenberg printing press with movable type, the Catholic Church had complete control of the interpretation of the Bible. They interpreted it, wrote it in Latin, calligraphy, handwritten, and so forth. Nobody else could interpret the Bible that way until the Gutenberg printing press enabled other people to interpret the Bible differently. And of course, Martin Luther, I think it's 502 years now, put his 95 Theses up on the Wittenberg church wall. And it kind of changed everybody's perception of who has authority for truth. And you saw many, many different points of view and religions materialize following that. Well, I believe we're having another Reformation today. And I believe that a Catholic university that was against the printing press when it started, they didn't like it because it competed with their interpretation of the Bible. When I told that to the head of the faculty the night before my presentation, she said, "That's not true." And I said, "Woo, I better not dwell on that too much." And I said, "Well, I don't need to make a big deal out of that. I have some videos and things to show that will enrich your students' understanding of international marketing and communications. But I think if you looked into it, you might find that that was true." So I left we had a sandwich the night before, and it took me 45 minutes to get back to our condominium in Naples. And by the time I got back to Naples, she had sent me about 25 emails. The first one started with, "You're right." And the rest of them had to do with different philosophers and history. I learned more from those 25 emails than I had in preparing the lecture. It was fascinating what she uncovered. And so I went ahead and did the presentation. And during the course of developing the presentation, I had had some conversations with different people I've worked with in my career to pick their brains. One of whom was John Pepper, the former CEO of the Procter & Gamble Company and the former non-executive chairman of the Walt Disney Company. And he was very interested in where I was heading with discovering truth. I also looked for input from people like Jane Goodall, that a friend helped me connect into, and Paul Pullman, the former CEO of Unilever. So I had the two biggest advertisers in the world involved in this. And it was really fascinating getting their points of view. And so this has really been a learning journey, and I'm still on the learning journey. And what I'm hoping is that by talking about this today, it'll kindle some thoughts that you have and that you might share with me. And the good, the bad, and the ugly. I don't profess to know everything, but I can only discuss this issue of truth from my area of expertise, and I intend to do so today. So how do people use information, and how do they, go back one, Gary, the point of the presentation is how we're being brainwashed into polarized beliefs that endanger America. I know that's a pretty hairy statement. In fact, when I started in on this journey, I didn't use brainwashed. I wasn't sure that it was appropriate. I wasn't sure that I knew enough about it. But I did remember meeting an individual when I first started in the advertising business, who was in charge of advertising development for Procter & Gamble. And he used to come into all the agencies and tell the agencies how to advertise. So some of the people thought he was a little arrogant. And his name is Norm Levy. He just turned 90. He lives in Hilton Head, and he and I have shared ideas and things ever since 45 years ago, 1972 or 40, whatever it is, when I started my career. What interested me about Norm is when I first met him, I was a junior account guy, and I asked him, his background. Well, he had joined Procter & Gamble in 1953 or 54, right after the Korean War. He had been in the U.S. He had been an U.S. intelligence agent in Korea, and his job was to work with American prisoners of war who had been brainwashed. He was to help them reacclimate to reentry into the United States.
I'm sorry, unmute yourself, Tim.
Oh, did it go up? Sorry. So what I've learned as I've gone down this journey is I'm a lot more bullish on thinking about brainwashing. And what I'm concerned about is the polarity that's happening. And I'm going to talk about why that might be, and how susceptible we are in a context where everybody has information overload. There's more information overload facing human beings today than any time in history. And, you can quote how many hours of information and educational messages and so forth. I think most of you will agree it's a lot more than when I had that channel changer and there were 3 channels. And go to the next chart. So I want to talk about how people use information and how they perceive truth, and how has digital access to information changed things. One of the principles that always helped me in examining a brand or a consumer's commentary or needs was a simple construct called belief dynamics. And belief dynamics says that our perceptions lead to our beliefs, and our beliefs lead to our behavior. And I've heard doctors from the Cleveland Clinic use this same construct in discussing what they've learned about doctors' advice to patients. So our perceptions lead to our beliefs, and our beliefs lead to behavior. And in the business that I was in for 43 years, we could examine somebody's behavior and work backwards to find out what their beliefs were that predicated that behavior, and then understand more deeply what their perceptions were. And it can go either way, and it's a very helpful tool to ask yourself, why are they doing that? Why do they believe that? Next slide. Gary? Okay, enough. You've gotten some of my background from John, so I won't go into it. Next. Okay. My overall conclusion, as I said earlier, is that we're experiencing a modern day Reformation. And what that means is that we've had uncertainty over who has authority for truth. Going back and looking at history of technological changes, which I studied in graduate school for my master's, I can see what happened when the first magazines became deliverable on the railway system in America, and Curtis Publishing owned Saturday Evening Post and Ladies Home Journal, and they became dominant national carriers of content to the American public. And they were unsupervised, and they didn't have standards. And there were times when shoddy advertising practices and false information appeared in their publications. A threat of national, you heard of yellow journalism. Certainly Theodore Roosevelt understood the value and power of the magazines and was noted for his ability to harness that power. But what we've learned is that the magazine industry was about to become under extreme pressure from the federal government. What really, because people were saying, I got taken. What is this snake oil? I went to look at the house that was advertised and it doesn't even exist. So there was a threat, and the industry got together and said, rather than have the government tell us what we can say or advertise or what we can advertise in, why don't we form a collaboration of industry parties, the advertisers in particular, because that's where the money comes from. That's how Curtis Publishing made their money, from advertising. And we also saw during that time that Hearst consolidated a lot of the newspapers in America, which gave tremendous power for who has authority for truth in the print media. That was a reformation that bore out the development of the advertising, the American Advertising Federation. It bore out the Association of National Advertisers. It bore out the Better Business Bureau. It bore out a combination of entities to bring some standards and values to the print media. Some of you may have heard of a guy named the Williams Creed at Missouri. It was around that time that he developed a list of things that he felt good journalism should be reflective of. And if you look, you can Google it and go see it, but it hasn't been used in too long. And one of the reasons is it's extraordinarily masculine and way outdated. but the principles about honesty and truth and reporting were like a Hippocratic oath for the journalist industry for years. I've recommended that the journalist industry re-examine it and redo their journalist creed. So the print media was a very, and this led up to World War I, and a very contentious time. The print media also finally helped the women get the right to vote, because they got behind it. And they got behind it because Saturday Evening Post and Ladies Home Journal were the two top magazines, the top media vehicles. The next kind of reformation that I think we've had is what I call the acoustic reformation. And this started with Marconi's invention of the wireless communication technology and was layered on into the ham radio operator. And the ham radio operator was set up to communicate with his other operators in his neighborhood or other places. I met the first head of the Radio Advertising Bureau on a fishing trip once. He was 90 years old. And he had started as a ham radio operator around 1910. And there was a threat that some of the radio operators were spewing information that wasn't true, or marketing ideas that were deceptive. And there was a fear that they were going to put extreme controls on the ham operators, and the ham operators were just beginning to network together into a radio network. So he became the head of the Radio Advertising Bureau, and he instituted planning on how to self-regulate the radio medium. The radio medium begat and wireless begat the public address system, which is a communication technology that most people overlook. But look at how it was used in pre-World War II Europe with the Nuremberg rallies by the master of propaganda, Goebbels. You could sit among 300,000 or 100,000 people and hear it directly from his voice. He was speaking the truth because you could hear it yourself. You didn't have to read about it. You didn't have to hear it from somebody else. You were there. You could judge whether it was true or not. And what an environment to take information in with all those flags and military stuff and it's just amazing the power of the public address system. And let's not forget that and the radio were also very strongly used by Roosevelt with his fireside chats, and Churchill and his speeches to the world and the British populace. Another guy who used it beautifully was Gandhi, to upset the standard for who has authority for truth in India. There he was using the radio, sitting there in his loincloth, talking with millions of people. It was extraordinarily powerful, and it changed how people perceived truth. It confused people, it changed people, and it also bred a lot of other points of view. So then that wireless evolved into the television, and McLuhan speaks a lot about the television era and that the medium is the message, and hot and cold media and all that other stuff that's I found very helpful. Some people thought he was on drugs because he spoke with a stream of consciousness method. But he used to start his presentations with this phrase. On the subject of who discovered the water, we're pretty sure it wasn't the fish. And his point was, it's hard when you're in the middle of a context to see the context evolve. You've all heard about the frog being put in the cold pot and heating it up and eventually jumping out, and or being thrown into a hot pot of water and jumping out. There's all kinds of different points of view about that analogy, but the point was that that a gradual change in your context is often imperceivable. And that's what McLuhan was talking about. He was also telling us that this was going to be the most unsettling time in world history once the television and the computer, which was just starting when he was doing his writings in the late 60s. He said this electronic collision is going to fundamentally change governments, businesses, how we work, philosophies, religions, because it's all going to be re-examined. There's going to be an explosion of information. And he also talked about the Dick Tracy wristwatch radio. And my God, here we are. A lot of you guys probably have an Apple Watch. I don't, but I've heard them, and they work like the Dick Tracy wristwatch radio. So what this has born is some new media platforms. And I'm glad John Osborne is listening in today. He's a long-term friend that I respect from the advertising business, and he's CEO of one of the largest media companies in the world, and he lives in Darien. So I recommend you have him come talk at some point. And Tom Lom, I worked with for years, is a stellar advertising executive that had a beautiful career, and he was always had good values, and I thought a good orientation around the truth. So we're having a reformation, and that's upsetting things. And next slide, please. Next slide. Some people think the internet's good. Some people think it's bad. Here's a little light relief to examine how you feel about it.
Some people think the internet is a bad thing. Somewhere your identity can be stolen, your home invaded, and your savings robbed without anyone setting foot inside your door. It is one of the most dangerous weapons ever created. A way for the unhinged to spread evil free of supervision or censorship. A place for mankind to exercise its darkest desires. An open market where you can purchase anything you want. Orwell was right. The internet has taken us to a place where everything we do is watched, monitored, and processed without us ever realizing. Some people think the internet is a bad thing. What do you think?
But wait.
Some people think the internet is a good thing. The most powerful educational tool the world has ever known. It's preserving our history, making sure that in the future we never forget the past. When disaster struck Asia, the volume of aid donated by ordinary people through websites outweighed that of their own governments. The internet is a place that is free of state regulation, censorship, and control. The only place where freedom of speech truly exists. Orwell was wrong. It is not the state that holds all the power. It is us. Some people think the internet is a good thing. What do you think?
So I talked about the need for some kind of oversight and value.
Some people think the internet is a bad
in the magazine industry. When the radio industry developed and there were similarly egregious problems with consumers, the advertisers demanded that the industry get together and self-regulate themselves. And then the television industry had the same thing. You remember that there were game shows where people already knew the answers and the viewers didn't know it, where doctors in white coats would show up and tell you that it's really healthy to smoke. All kinds of things that consumers complained about and asked how they could get some kind of standards. So I grew up in the business during the television era and saw, its effect with the Kennedy-Nixon debate and a whole bunch of things, and how the civil rights movement was advanced by people being able to see what's happening on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in real time. My mother was from Alabama. She told me that they took care of their people down there. And at about 6 or 7 years old, I was watching TV, as I would often do at our house because my dad was a television repairman. And I asked my mom to come in and look at the German shepherds and the fire hoses being sprayed on the people on Edmund Pettus Bridge. And she said, that's wrong. And her truth changed. Not completely, because she became a fan of George Wallace later in her life. But my point is that we're at a stage now where, with the internet, and when the internet started, and it really didn't impact on our lives. It started off as the computer started off as a word processing tool, if you remember. Most of us used it for replacing our typewriters. But it wasn't until around 1995 that the World Wide Web came on and started affecting things. I was stationed in Brussels, Belgium, and I had a global job for the advertising agency I was working at, launching brands like Crest toothpaste and Always Feminine hygiene pads everywhere, including Middle East and Africa. So I saw how it changed my life, like that little up-down switch. Instead of using faxes and leaving voice messages, I could email somebody and get up in the morning and have an answer. I could email because there's 24 different time zones, so I could very, very easily understand where somebody was. And it was addictive being that in touch. It was also addictive from the standpoint of the people that I worked with got used to the fact that they could send me something and I'd be up looking at it. And so they thought maybe I could help them with it, and usually I did. But I found myself losing a lot of sleep and had a real issue with this at one point, and had to go off the grid for a little bit. And I know many people that did. What happened, though, as in the video you just saw, is media changed from television, radio, and all these other things that are still there. But content creation shifted to people, to individuals who can create it, share it. With the internet, we're all able to set up a website, set up a site with other people and position it as news. There's a gazillion different things. But when the internet started, the internet, my clients like Procter & Gamble and Nissan and Johnson & Johnson and Mars Corporation, some of the biggest advertisers, Pepsi-Cola, they said, we'll never advertise on that. I'll never see myself looking at a commercial on one of these. And I agreed with them. The disconnect happened when we all went home and saw our children sitting in front of the TV, sitting in front of one of these, multitasking. So we said, we better learn about that. And the advertising industry started shifting some money into digital media. But it was hard to know whether it was effective or not. All we could look at is things like clicks. And it became very important for the CEO of a company to be able to tell his shareholders or her shareholders that they're in digital media in a big way, because it would look like they were asleep at the wheel if they weren't. But I tell you that there was a challenge from the beginning as to knowing whether it's effective or not, and it also shifted the advertising industry from selling location and real estate to selling eyeballs. You recall that we used to have newspaper ads that if they were above the fold, there was research that said they were read more. So they cost more for that position than below the fold, or the back cover cost more than an inside page. Well, that is what I mean by selling real estate. But when the internet happened and we started doing banner ads, your banner ad could be number 20 in the length of the clicking that's going on. And you don't know what its value is relative to being in there at an earlier click rate. So it was something that our clients were very interested in because they saw the shift happening. They believed that the internet was a good thing. And then the internet platforms started coming out, and YouTube and Google and Facebook and so forth. And if you look at the history, they didn't really come in until after 2001. There was a big event, and most of the internet companies thought that they were going to make their money on subscriptions. They didn't think they'd make it on advertising. Remember the client saying, "I'm never advertising on this." Well, technology has evolved, and we know that people are streaming everything these days. But the people who were in the setting up platforms thought that their money would come from subscriptions. And one of the first, there were a couple of legal cases that happened in the early 90s, 95, 96 timeframe, when the internet was just starting to change our lives. And that change that happened led to a couple of precedents in the legal frame. One was that is called the CompuServe case, and it's covered in a podcast that I did with Carla Nicoletti, who is the former head of legal counsel for the Leo Burnett Company worldwide, and she's a very involved industry executive in self-regulation. But that first case somebody brought against CompuServe because they felt that they had been harmed by content on CompuServe's platform. But the Supreme Court decided that CompuServe wasn't liable because CompuServe never said they would edit the content. They never said that they led expectations that they would. They really thought of themselves as a telephone company, giving you the line. And then the second case was Stratford Prodigy. And this was about a company that was going to do an IPO. And the information came over the Prodigy platform that harmed the IPO. And so they sued Prodigy. And in that case, the Supreme Court did allow damages from Prodigy. And the reason was Prodigy had in its contract that the material that the advertiser was bringing to their platform would have the option to be reviewed. And because of that, it was deemed that the Stratford people expected them to review material for its accuracy and truthfulness. And in this case, they didn't. Then there was another case of a guy who was a radio operator in Oklahoma City. And he decided to come out with some t-shirts after the bombing in Oklahoma City, make a little money with hats and t-shirts saying, "Oklahoma City, it's a blast." And he started getting hate mail and everything else because it was on the internet. And so these issues of whose responsibility it is were pre-set up, and we're still discussing them. After the case with the bombing and the t-shirts, we saw the development of what many of you have heard is Section 230 of the Communications Decency Code. They felt that we needed something like that to prevent something like come to Oklahoma City, it's a blast. So that's the evolution, and the evolution is still happening. But Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, they were protected. And so they started making boatloads of money on advertising as more of our effort shifted to digital media. And it didn't shift away from television or radio or print or outdoor. It was in addition to. But what happened was our industry changed. And then we had the advent of what many of you have been hearing about, which is artificial intelligence. And I heard about this right before I retired in 2013. I heard that we were about to have the semantic web, an evolution of communications technology. And what the semantic web would be is they'd be able to read your language, read your behavior on the internet, and direct messages to you that are in keeping with your predispositions. Many of you have seen this. If with COVID, I had a friend who said that she couldn't go to the LA Fitness, so she was going to get an exercise mat for at home. And she started looking on the internet, and the next thing she knows, she's got all kinds of emails coming to her about exercise stuff. That's what happened with the semantic web. That's why you see so much information when you're interested in something. And we also evolved to what our clients were then saying, well, Tim, why don't we do the buying ourselves? It can all be done on computer. We don't need the middleman anymore. We don't need the media buying company. And a company like General Motors spends enough in advertising that we'll have enough clout. We don't need the clout that you get from your aggregated media buying in your agency. Ours will be even bigger because we're going to aggregate all of General Motors advertising, or Toyota's. And this put the fear of God in the advertising agency business. And so what you saw develop was something called the trading desk. And I went to see the guy who started our trading desk at Omnicom because I didn't know what it was about. And he told me what was going to happen. And he talked about programmatic media buying. And programmatic media buying is done with artificial intelligence. It can direct messages to the content you're interested in. It can then keep track of whether or not that message has been had an opportunity to be seen, and it can automatically distribute the advertising revenue from the advertiser to that website. So we could start a Darien Men's Association website news station. And if we were smart with algorithms, we could have this whole thing appear as though it really exists and have fake clicks and everything else because it's an algorithm war. And what we could start doing is we could start siphoning money off the information highway from the clients. And believe me, the clients know this and they're very concerned about it. We also have detected in the last year that foreign bad actors and domestic bad actors can also set up fake sites and do the same thing. So it's very concerning, not unlike the early days of magazines, radio, and TV. And what you're going to see is a lot of change starting to happen. And the same arguments will be heard about freedom of speech. And the key thing is, how do you self-regulate when an individual creates content? That's a question I asked the industry in 2006. That was before Twitter. That was before an individual could create content and share it. So what's happened is there's a lot of misinformation. It's polarizing both liberals and conservatives because they're feeding their diet, and with information overload, is to self-restrict to some degree so that they can, not go crazy with all the information. And it's very unsettling to think maybe you were wrong about something. Next slide. Nope, next. Next. So I'm talking about Twitter. And all media has been affected by Twitter. And you know that now because we lived through 3.5 years of Twitter messages, morning, noon, and night. And those Twitter messages weren't fact-checked. There was no responsibility for the content. And they were distributed to 80 million followers. Now, Barack Obama, his Twitter address actually has more followers. He has 108 million reported. But it isn't his primary method of communication. And he's not citing policy or discussing international events on Twitter. And the news media had to follow these things because it was news. So it was like an amplification every time there was a tweet. And in the 6 months leading up to the election, our president had 28 tweets per day. Think about yourself. Put your cell phone in your hand and try and use your day to do 28 at all hours of the day. Unsupervised, unedited, and on a device that's unsecure. So this is why Twitter took them off. It wasn't politics, it was safety. And there's a lot of changes going on. Twitter was first. Facebook has been reluctant. About 90, I'm told 90% of Facebook's revenues come from advertising. So they're being very careful. And I've talked to Facebook in the podcast series, episode number 4. It was fascinating because I had trouble getting somebody to come, but I got an old colleague to come, and he was brilliant. But he volunteered without me asking that Facebook knew that their platform was being invaded by the internet advertising research company in St. Petersburg, Russia. And all the people in the studio, when he said that, their mouths dropped, because we had this thing going on about it, some fat guy on the edge of a bed, and Putin saying, why would I do that? All we had to do is ask Facebook. They can tell where it comes from. And they were being quiet. Well, he divulged that, and I thought that was really interesting. So it's never been doubtful, and it's subsequently been proven that by the Mueller report and by other U.S. intelligence services, that our system of information is still being compromised. And it's not one way or the other, it's to divide us. So information overload is the worst it's been in history. People are the first media today. People have more control over information they access, and they self-restrict to sources to confirm the prior beliefs. The first podcast that I did was a reflection of a blog that John Pepper had written called The Pursuit of Truth. And what John did was study George Orwell's life and what was going on when he wrote the book. The book, 1984, came out in 1945, and Orwell died in 1949. But what John did was he tried to understand what was going on with Orwell and what did Orwell really think about 1984? What was he trying to say? It was interesting that Orwell experienced two totalitarian governments and times in our history, certainly the World War II, but also the Spanish War, which he got involved in. And that jaded his belief about totalitarian governments and communication. You know, the liberals in the 1950s who read 1984 thought that the book was written indicting the Russians. The conservatives in the Labour Party or the party in England and also in the United States thought that it was being written about the liberals. Each side thought it was the other side that was being indicted. But from that, John concluded one of the most important things that I would ask you to entertain. And that is when there is a general lack of consensus, public consensus, and it becomes polarized. Orwell said it creates an opportunity for extremist thinkings and fanatics. And before the autocrats that he experienced, both in Germany and in Spain, there was a period of a lack of who had trust and who had truth, and people were confused. And one of the things that I would suggest you look at is I went back and I looked at what Hitler had to say about this, because I wanted to know what Goebbels said. And Goebbels helped him with Mein Kampf. And in Mein Kampf, they talk about the big lie and the fact that if you say something long enough, people will eventually believe it. They weren't the first to say it. Lenin said it too. And it influenced things. It never goes away. It always leaves a tail. Somebody will believe it. So the next thing that I would ask you to read is to look at the Organization of Overseas Information that existed at the end of World War II, or in World War II. And this is not called the CIA then, but they did a report, and the report is in the US archives. And the report is, what are we going to do when the war is over, and how we deal with the Nazis and Hitler? They were already planning ahead to have a strategy of how they would be dealt with in terms of negotiating. D-Day hadn't happened yet. All of this stuff was many years away, but they started looking and analyzing. And what they concluded was some pretty startling things about lying, the big lie, and how one who is a liar behaves. And our government used that both with Russia and Germany. Next slide, please. What I believe is happening is that with this information overload, we're self-editing. We have to. We can't read everything. I'm sure many of you have reduced the sources of some of the information that you've gotten. Some people have gotten away from any newspaper at all. Some people only watch one news station because they believe it, and the other ones upset them. I also believe that this intellect appetite disorder, which is not unlike intellect anorexia, it's a psychological problem, was evidenced in the January 6th attack on the Capitol. I think that I've talked to people who, and you've probably heard some have said that they're blaming it, that they were convinced by Fox News or somebody else. But there are people working on this, And I talked with a guy in Washington yesterday, and troubling thing is starting, because they're starting to see the same kind of email dialogue that happened weeks before January 6th in anticipation of a potential indictment in New York City around the cases that are pending there. Next slide. Advertising fraud. It's the side effect of programmatic planning and buying, and it's enabling Russian and other criminal entities to create confusion on the backs of legitimate advertisers. And that's where we're seeing that they're able to siphon off advertising money. And that's why the advertisers are just now putting their foot down on Twitter and Facebook and Google and YouTube. And they're saying, you guys we gotta do something collectively. And what I'm involved in now is trying to resurrect a form of self-regulation with the new entities. And I know John Osborne will be involved in that, given his position and influence in the industry. Next slide. I think that, Gary, you lost one there about how do you determine truth? Okay.
Video?
How do you determine truth?
This one, Tim?
Yeah.
This is the truth. If we turn things upside down, we can't be the best country in the world. I'd be lying to you if I said that Argentina has a great future ahead, that we will be a safe country, that our economy will be strong, that our children will be healthy, get an education, and have jobs. Before anything, you must know, our country does not deserve such things. And I'm convinced of this because I know the Argentine people. Corruption and hypocrisy are in our nature. I refuse to believe under any circumstances that we could be a great country in the coming years. Thanks to the people's votes, this country is sinking to new depths. But there are even more surprises to come. Argentina has only one destiny. And whether we like it or not, this is what is real. You should know that I believe exactly the opposite. This is what is real. And whether you like it or not, Argentina has only one destiny. There are even more surprises to come. This country is sinking to new depths. But thanks to the people's votes, we could be a great country in the coming years. I refuse to believe under any circumstances that corruption and hypocrisy are in our nature. And I'm convinced of this because I know the Argentine people. Our country does not deserve such things. Before anything, you must know that our children will be healthy, get an education, and have jobs. That our economy will be strong. That we will be a safe country. Argentina has a great future ahead. I would be lying to you if I said that we can't be the best country in the world if we turn things upside down. This is the truth.
I'm going to wrap up and allow time for questions and answers, but I wanted to say that if you look up the definition of truth and you study it, truth isn't a fact. It isn't what somebody says. It's what your interpretation is. Nietzsche, the German scholar, said, "There are no facts, only interpretation." The dictionary definition of truth is a fact or belief that is accepted as true. So the important element in there is your acceptance. You decide what you believe is true or false. And there's all kinds of research going on right now. There's two landmark studies that were done in the last year. One was done with with Twitter at MIT, and they found that false stories communicate faster and farther than real stories. And if you're in the advertising business, you kind of can understand that, because people seek novelty and they gravitate for something that they don't know, because they don't want to be caught not knowing it. So what we have going on as people become the first media is we have a context where we're very vulnerable to false information, because it's harder to tell what's real and what isn't. And we know that if you're in the business of making advertising dollars by building audiences, you're going to be a little less concerned about how truthful your message is. We know, for example, that whether it's MSNBC or Fox News, having an exclusive diet of any one of those is dangerous. The Pew Research Center has done research about people's perception of the pandemic. 79% of people who are regular Fox users believed that it was a hoax. Where did they get that? There's arguments on either side, and we can all get into a lot of whataboutism. I've had a lot of people tell me, well, you're a liberal, Tim. My brother has said, you're too liberal. I was born Republican in a suburb of Cleveland, Ohio. My standard for a president was Eisenhower. He wasn't perfect, but I was Republican, and I'm still Republican by a thread. And I mean a thread, because after last week, I'm shaking my head. I hope this is helpful to you. I have some next steps that we can go through. One is take personal responsibility for creating a more respectful, civil, and satisfying communication environment. I know you've all had incidences like I've had, where you just, at some point you have to say, well, we're going to disagree on this. Why don't we talk about baseball? And remember that division and angst that you're feeling is exactly what our enemies want to have happen. And that's why industry self-regulation is needed. Industry self-regulation is more effective and efficient than government regulation. And Orwell wasn't kidding about the Ministry of Truth. We don't need that. We need the advertisers who spend the money, the agencies that create the messaging, the media buying companies that help place it, to collaborate together with the FTC and the Better Business Bureau on a set of standards that will allow people to be more responsible for the content. Yesterday afternoon, the first audiobook of based on the podcast series was released. It's free, because I'm so concerned that people aren't examining their use of media. Next slide. Some of the people, there's 17 chapters, and I've edited them down from the podcast series. So if you want to listen to something, you can go to the podcast series, which is on all podcast carriers. But the first chapter starts with an interview of me about what I discussed about John Pepper and Orwell in 1984. The second chapter is an interview with John Pepper about leadership in this environment, and John Pepper knows something about leadership. The third chapter is from Keith Reinhard, who is chairman emeritus of DDB, and Keith really worked hard to inform us about what are bots, what are deep fake videos, giving us suggestions of how to not be vulnerabilized by the information we're using. It's really a tutorial. Truth Across Generations by Joe Plummer, who's a professor of marketing at Columbia University and a notable strategic planning talent in the advertising business. The History of Truth is with Norm Levy, the guy who was the US intelligence agent who was, he really worked hard on looking at the history of truth, if you're interested. Truth and Ethics, I interview Wally Snyder, who is a lawyer who worked at the FTC for many years, and then he became the CEO of the American Advertising Federation. And now he has started the Institute for Advertising Ethics, and he's literally written the book on it. He's a very talented guy and ethicist when you get to it. Truth in Facebook was interesting because I scored a win by having my friend Will Platt Higgins join me for the conversation. They have not been as interested in coming back, but that one's worth listening to. Number 8 is Stefan Lorky, who's the CEO of the World Federation of Advertisers in Belgium. And what he talks about is what they learned before our election about Russian disinformation in France and at the EU. They're like a canary in the coal house for some of the stuff that we're still debating here. Number 9 is Dr. Augustine Fu, who's a cybersecurity expert, and he's the guy that coined the phrase ad fraud. And he's brilliant. He's an MIT grad, and he'll explain ad fraud to you, and it really shakes you. Then I go to Erwin Gottlieb, who was the head of media planning and buying for WPP company, the largest media company in the world. And I've mentioned some of the other people. I think you'll find Tom DeLong, professor at Harvard Business School, particularly interesting on authentic leadership. And what he says is leadership that isn't afraid to be vulnerable.
Tim, I want to make sure, and I hate to interrupt, but
I'm done.
I want to make sure that, okay, thank you, sorry.
Yep.
Okay, could I pick it up from here, John?
Please.
Tim, let's go into some questions. You've come up with some solutions, and we talked about this the other day. Industry self-regulation is what you believe is the key to all this. Who's going to be responsible for setting that up and getting resolution?
Well, that's the problem right now. There's conversations going on and a high degree of frustration because most of the guys that are doing this have day jobs, and they're working on a runaway train. Pace of business today is a lot faster than it was when we were there with all this information and communication technology. But what we're trying to do is marshal the forces of those that have been involved in self-regulation before. The Better Business Bureau, which is part of the Department of Commerce, and they have the National Advertising Division, which I would think digital should be part of their remit. The FTC, because there needs to be a governmental legal dimension to this and consequence. The advertisers, called the American National Association of National Advertisers, they're involved now in trying to figure out how they interact. But it's also global because the information that's coming into your machine there isn't just inside the US, it's coming from anywhere. So we've got to have the World Federation of Advertisers. And frankly, they're like many of you who dealt with clients that were expanding internationally. It's a fairly new thing. And the associations, which are nonprofit associations, aren't used to working collaboratively. They're worried about their own, donations. So it's a challenge, but I think the problem is acute enough that it's starting to people are starting to say we have to do something.
Yeah.
And it's as I said, people are watching this and they're telling us that this is continuing. And the term they used is quit thinking about this as liberal or conservative. Think about it as agnostic,
Yeah.
like Waco. And that scared me.
Yeah. Okay, let's bring in some questions from members of the audience. Charles Salmons, you had your hand up first.
Thank you. And thank you, Tim, for a very provocative discussion. Some of what you were talking about kind of leads into a discussion I'm going to lead tomorrow, which is on COVID and where we stand and where we're going with that. And, I just made note of kind of your thought of working backwards, which seems like it's really appropriate on the whole question of people who are reluctant to get vaccinated.
Right.
Because their behavior is no to vaccine. Where do they? What beliefs do they have? Well, there's much less trust in the CDC and the National Institute of Health and so on, and then that goes back to perceptions, which are formed by all the sources of information that they get, which is sort of self-selecting, as you have observed, as opposed to the days of Cronkite and Huntley Brinkley, where everybody kind of got a centralized message.
And Walter Cronkite used to say, and that's the way it was.
Yeah. That's the way it is, he said. The question is, our faith in all of these institutions is crumbling. If you go look at surveys of everything from Congress to the news media to you name it, what's to be done about that?
Well, I think the first job that has to happen is people need to understand that they're being manipulated and that it's confusing. And what is happening is exactly what our adversaries want to have happen. And there's things you can read to find out about that. Oddly enough, if you get my email address or you want to talk, I could talk later today because I'm kind of immobile. But in my building in Naples is the sister-in-law of Anthony Fauci. And she came to me in the early days and I said, he's going to be blamed. They don't have anybody else to blame. Watch. She said, oh, no, he won't. He won't be blamed. I said, yes, he will. There's research coming in all the time, Charles. Some research just came in that I could send you by the Pew Research Center, and they were studying the root of the misinformation about COVID. And they found that it narrows down to a core of 12 people who are publishing information that is false. And they have 59 million followers. And that 59 million followers has their own community that they share the information with. This is what's happening. There's real poison in the system. And if the platforms don't step up, it's a bad scene. And they must step up because the advertisers need to be able to talk to consumers. Yeah. They need to be able to talk to them with trust and a high degree of reliability. Yeah, you're right. Look at how people feel about the NFL, how they feel about baseball. There isn't a thing that people aren't griping about. We have one of the most divided times in our country in ages.
Okay, let's move on. Harry Bergen.
Thank you, and thank you for that chat.
Thank you for your guitar playing.
In the overall scheme of things, to me, the issue is not just what is being said, but to me, obvious things that are not being said, and covered by what used to be prominent and well-regarded newspapers, New York Times, Wall Street Journal. I used to pick up USA Today once in a while, and I'll give you an example of that. And this goes back to the relatively early days of the George Floyd death in Minneapolis. And as soon as that thing came out, I went online and went to find, and the newspapers, of course, to find out first who's this guy Derek Chauvin, and very quickly found out that there were a number of incidents where he was involved and had civilian complaints against him, though as is police policy, they don't reveal those. But I found that very quickly. Yep. The other thing I found, and I said, okay, let me find out who is this man, George Floyd. And quickly, what I was able to find was a very general discussion. He had some run-ins with the law. Yep. But I want to know, drugs, okay. But I want to know, well, what were they? What was that run-in with the law?
You can find out. It's all there.
I did. But you know where I found, who was the first to break that story? The Daily Mail in the UK.
Yeah. Guardian does a pretty good job too. So do the Canadian newspapers.
Right. It seems that it's all my thought about the reason the Daily Mail, and I'm sorry, and by the way, the body cam footage that ultimately got released, Daily Mail, they got their hands on that first.
By the way, I left that out. One of the biggest things that I think we can all agree is the body cam and the constant video surveillance of spaces in this country has been a game changer. People have been saying that these kind of unjust beatings have been going on for years, and it's been now you have to look at the video yourself and say, are my eyes lying to me or not?
Yep, we do. But again, what I wanted to see is why wasn't that released by the Journal? Even I have to admit, even Fox News didn't break that one right away. No. And of course, they'd love a story like that, but they didn't. But and I think my theory was, had they done that and said, hey, by the way, the crime was a home invasion, armed home invasion, which was not a very pretty sight, and George did 5 years for that. Now, people will then come back and say, oh, well, does that justify his killing? Of course not. But why can't I have all the information? I think the Daily Mail can release that because they're thinking nobody's going to be burning down buildings in Piccadilly Circus. So no problem with me releasing it. Do you ever see, do you think that there's some problem with the newspapers, again, the well-regarded news sources, as being afraid?
I believe that journalism will play a role, as it does in a free society, in helping us with this issue. But in a world where there is no consensus of opinion, the news media waits, hesitates, they're afraid to commit because tomorrow or in the next 10 seconds, there could be another video or another thing. So it's also because there are so many sources. It was simpler when you had major newspapers and 3 networks. I think things are a lot better today and that I have more information and I can learn more, but it's created a very dense and competitive assortment of sources that you can look at. The information you can find, it's just doing the work to find it. And a lot of the publications and stations, they want to protect their viewers. And so they don't want to put something on that'll piss their viewers off without certainty. So they're not going to do it. One of the things that I'd like you to look at was, I was tipped off on this yesterday, there were some sites that cropped up around George Floyd's death that purported to be Black Lives Matter. Take a look at them and see if they don't look fishy to you. There's a lot of misinformation happening, and on both sides, on all sides.
Okay, let's call
So
on.
one of the things that I recommend is that you become more critically analytical of the information that you take, that you analyze your sources of information, and given this lack of general consensus and the massive amounts of information, try not to limit yourself to only one vector of communication or source. It's dangerous because nobody has a leg up on truth. It's up
Tim,
to you to determine it.
Tim, that's good advice, but with all due respect, I've got a job. And when I'm paying for this
Harry,
stuff,
Harry, can I interrupt you there? We've got a lot of people lined up for questions. So I've got to cut you short, I'm afraid. Mike Wheeler.
Two noted journalists, Steve Brill and Gordon Krovitz, have started a kind of like a good housekeeping site called NewsGuard for news organizations, where they give them the yellow NewsGuard that the site has been deemed credible by their reviewers. Now, what they're pushing for is advertisers who, through their programmatic buying, end up on clickbait sites to keep those marginal sites alive. If the advertisers would first go to run their buy through NewsGuard so that they only buy sites that have been deemed credible by independent sources, and not end up on keeping marginal sites alive, because that's who gets bought by programmatic.
Yeah. One of the problems is that's a very good thing, and it's an encouraging step. There's a bunch of companies. There's one in Washington now called Trustworthy Accountability Group, and they put a good housekeeping seal on the stuff that they see. And unfortunately, it's not perfect. And they're asking the advertisers to spend a lot of money to be part of the program. And once you watch Augustine Fu cut him to shreds, because he thinks that they're providing false security. They're allowing clients to say, hey, shareholders, we've got something on that. We're doing this Trustworthy Accountability Group, or the thing that you mentioned. And that always happens when there's dissension and need for change. You got to just keep working it and not look for perfection, look for progress. And there's going to be more of these companies. They're all fighting with each other. Whose company should be the good housekeeping seal? But I think in the next 6 months, it's going to evolve more assertively, because I think the advertisers are now realizing that they need to be more assertive.
Okay, let me move on. Bob Viner, are you one of our guests?
Yes, I am.
Bob.
Thank you. Hi, Tim.
He's a Naval Academy grad, submariner, and ex-PNGer. And he's writing a book about re-looking at the Constitution for a modern world.
And looking at truth in advertising, political speech, if you will, is a part of it. And it's based on work that Tim and I did together 35 years ago on the issue of environmental goodness of products and packages. And we did get industry self-regulation in that area, that both the head of the FTC and the head of the National Association of Attorneys General Green Marketing Task Force supported. And they agreed with what Tim said, which was self-regulation will be far more effective than government or legal challenges to individual pieces of bad news. But I think for political speech, it's a little trickier than environmental
it's
speech.
totally unregulated.
Yeah.
You can say whatever you want. There's There's no consequence.
I,
And that's
what,
probably going to have to change.
what I came to believe and write about was that the basis for what we did before was to put the onus for truth on the speaker. In other words, you had to be able to support with evidence that other people believed supported your claim, and it then all the distributing media needed to do was to ask you for the proof. They didn't have to be the judges. They just said to you, "What's your proof? Show us the proof."
Process of proof. Yep.
Process of proof. If you didn't have it, then I'm not going to air your message. So I think that would work with a portion of political speech, but there's always a portion of political speech that's opinion, that's projection, and that's the tougher thing to ever regulate. But if you keep it separate from items that people are if we limit it, in other words, the debate just to that, we'd be far better off. Yeah. But right now, for example, on the COVID thing, you have people saying things that aren't supported by truth or any evidence. The claim that the election was stolen, there's not a single bit of evidence or fact that indicates there's any widespread voter fraud. Yet we're getting 300 pieces of legislation to solve a problem nobody's identified. It's all based on ideology, not based on fact. So, Tim, what do you think? Is that?
Well, there's two ways to look at everything. I'm reminded that you and I know a guy, an ex-P&Ger, who became CEO of the Clorox company, and when the thing came out about taking disinfectant, his sales went up.
Yeah. But then he also decried it.
Yes, he did.
Yeah, you did.
He did. He did the responsible thing.
Right.
Okay. Can I move on to Joe Spain?
Yep.
Joe, you need to unmute.
Yes. I think that you said, Tim, that some foreign adversaries of our system are sowing messages that are being divisive for the American society. And I wasn't clear how they were getting those messages through and having that effect, and who was letting it go to make money. I thought that was the gist of what you were saying. If I misinterpreted it,
No.
Straighten me out.
I'll try and make it simpler. You and I could set up a website for sugar cookies, and there's a lot of sugar cookie people out in the world. You know, the whole thing about long tail, and there are a bunch of little sites of people writing about sugar cookies and recipes and stuff like that. To reach those people, you have to do it by machine. You can't sit down and negotiate for each one of those people. So that's what you're looking at. You and I then could set up a website, and through the use of the algorithms we use, it's an algorithm war. Nobody's looking at it. Nobody's approving it. And when we try and put up some algorithm to block the Russians from coming in with their algorithm, they change it. It's unbelievable. It's like whack-a-mole. So you and I set up this site, and all of a sudden we start seeing advertising come to us. We're making $10,000 a week, and all we're doing is sitting here staring at each other, and we're making the money in our sleep. And that's because the money is distributed by programmatic and machine, and foreign entities can enter into that stream through the use of their own algorithms. And that's what they're doing. It's very hard to, and you almost have, it's a war. You have to be watching. It's like hacking. And you and I don't see it, but it's happening all the time because they can see it. Facebook sees it, YouTube sees it, Twitter sees it. They know. And it's not just foreign, it's bad actors domestically who are just trying to set up some bogus way to make money. It's a very impure communication environment.
Yeah.
And it's important that you assume that it's impurity before you rely on the information you're receiving.
Why isn't 60 Minutes doing a expose on something like this?
They've had some things in there, some movies that on Netflix, John Osborne will remember what the name of it, but it's about the digital, what's happening with your information, your personal information, and how it's being exploited. 60 Minutes is in the TV business, and they do have websites, but I think 60 Minutes has already done some things on this, and there'll be more.
Okay.
Thanks.
Bob McGroty.
Hi, Tim. Thank you. Real fast, do you believe that they should reinstate the fairness doctrine for broadcasters?
I don't know. I would have to study that more specifically. I've kind of been.
It basically, it was initiated a long time ago, and
Yeah.
in 1987.
I know what it is. It's where
Yeah, I know it is.
you're obligated to give an alternative point of view.
Contrasting opinions and in the public interest.
It's hard to do that on an internet site.
This is only for broadcasters.
I know.
Radio
Well,
and
for broadcast, that would be probably helpful. And we used to have some laws about high magazine weapons too, and assault rifles. We don't have that anymore.
Thank you.
Okay, are there any more questions? Mark.
One last question. Thank you, Tim, for coming today. I was in Italy when they had the Brexit vote. I just happened to be vacationing there. And that evening, I watched German, French, Italian, British TV. Uniformly, they were all completely astonished. And there was little to no information on, it goes back to what Harry Bergen was talking about, on why Brexit succeeded, except when they would bring in somebody like Nigel Farage who would do an interview, et cetera, et cetera. And I think one of the reasons that people mistrust the media is that they don't see a kind of a man on the street. I don't know what you want to call it, because there have been a lot of academic work prior to Brexit, which kind of indicated a great deal of unhappiness, not just in England, but in France and most of the European Union countries, with one segment of the society who just didn't agree with this for various reasons. And what astonished me, well, what didn't astonish me really, which it just kind of surprised me to see the uniformity of complete surprise by these journalists that this could ever happen.
It's sort of like when Trump won.
Every country. I mean, so you had nobody in the newsroom who was actually aware that this thing might really pass. And they were kind of dismissing it, but at the same time, they were shocked. So I'd just be interested in your comments on that. And
what I'd like you to listen to is on the audiobook, chapter 8 with Stephen Lorke. He goes into the whole thing with Brexit. They know that it was infiltrated. And also, if you haven't seen the movie about Cambridge Analytica, it's an English film. I recommend it. And I don't remember the name of it, but it's scary what was going on.
Right, but I mean, the media has always taken sides. And you go back to Jefferson, Republicans and so forth, versus Adams, Federalists. There was a huge media battle. The same thing happened with Jackson, John Quincy Adams, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes.
And it's happening now in a much more magnified way because of social media. And I guess I'll definitely listen to that chapter 8, but I think what really shocks me is that there's so many in the media who just cannot see that there is another opinion in the hearts of their countries, not just in America, but pretty much every Western country, who has a very different opinion. And you know, that opinion is not shown. And I think that's one of the successes of Fox News that Roger Ailes saw, that this opinion was simply being ignored. And you can say it's been magnified out of proportions, and I tend to agree, but that's the nature of the human animal. We're mimetic creatures.
Yeah. Only thing I'd say about that is I would be wary of eating a steady diet of one source, especially
Absolutely.
Fox News, because
I agree
most
with
of
you.
the Fox News is owned by Murdoch,
Right.
and you really need to be balancing. If you want a balanced point of view, don't watch just Fox News.
Well, I don't really want to watch any of them.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is that
Yeah, but you can't help it because you go into a barber shop or a fitness center and the TV's got Fox News on because they have the stock ticker tape running. That was a huge thing that Ailes did, because he made his television monitors more relevant to more people as America shifted from having its wealth in bank savings account in the mid 90s to shifting to have most of its wealth in the stock market. Huge. Really made Fox more attractive.
yeah, well, we're not going to solve this today, but anyway, I just thought it was an interesting thing.
Another one that you would enjoy is it's not in the book, but it's one of the podcasts I interviewed. I went up and asked an advertising executive in Canada for what we look like to them. And it's very interesting. He was very creative and funny, but you know, seeing what other people say and how they report is very important. I think it's good that you're reading other things.
Yeah. Okay, John Bachelor, let's have the final comment or question from you.
I was just going to ask Tim, I could do this offline, but I was just wondering, what do we do about the hacking that the Russians are doing against us? Why can't we do the same thing to them or more? I mean,
we can, but it needs to be identified as a military and government priority. And it's not very helpful when somebody says that Russia isn't doing it and it's a 400-pound fat guy on a bed. It's not helpful.
Right. Well, thank you.
Okay, well, on that happy note, we're going to have to
thank you, guys.
Get back to you on this. Tim, many thanks for your time and for laying the groundwork for a pretty broad-based discussion. We really appreciate it.
Well, I hope you guys will take a cut at listening to the audiobook, because it's a lot easier to listen to an edited chapter than individual podcasts. And I edited them down to be shorter and more precise.
Gary, can we put a link to that on the speaker section?
Consider it done.
Good.
Great.
Good. Okay. So there you go, Tim. Many
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, John and Bob and Tom. It's good to see some friendly faces.
Thanks, Tim.
See you later.
Tim.
Thank you.
Be well.
Bye then.